Hello, everyone. We are Team Aid, and today we'll be presenting our case on the East Palestine Trail derailment. My name is Mohit Ahir, and I'm doing my master's in chemical engineering in second year.
Hello everyone, my name is Lynda and I'm in my first year chemical engineering masters.
Hello guys, my name is Nirmit. I'm a first year graduate student in chemical engineering.
Hey guys, my name is Viraj and I am doing my master's in chemical and petroleum engineering as well. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to start this presentation with a brief case summary. On the 3rd of February 2023, 38 rail cars carrying hazardous materials derailed. After the derailment, a fire started which posed a risk of an explosion. This resulted in the evacuation of residents within a 1-mile radius. As a result, it was decided to execute a controlled release of vinyl chloride burning in a trench. This was an intentional release of chemicals into the environment. From this release, residents reported experiencing symptoms and thousands of fish died downstream. This resulted in a huge cleanup effort where over 167,000 tons of contaminated soil and tens of millions of gallons of tainted water were removed. After the aftermath, the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the reason for the derailment was due to a defective wheel bearing that overheated. In addition, the report found that the decision for a controlled burn was unnecessary. Now I'm going to pass it over to Lynda, who's going to talk about the personal beliefs and biases.
Let's go over some personal beliefs and biases pertaining this tragic incident. There's a long list of biases in this case, but I'll go over a few. Normalization of deviance. This simply means when unsafe behavior or risky conditions becomes a norm just because nothing bad has happened. In this context, the company and regulators had seen small safety issues before, like hot bearings or leaking valves, but because previous trips didn't end in disaster, they accepted this risk as part of a normal operation. Confirmation bias, which simply means focusing on information that supports what you already have and ignoring evidence that challenges it. In this case, after the derailment, company officials and some decision makers initially emphasized that air and water tests were safe instead of fully investigating community complaints or independent data. Profit and cost motivated reasoning. This means letting financial cost concerns influence decision more than safety. Attaining this case, the company had delayed safety upgrades and resisted adopting newer braking system because of cost concerns. Now I'm going to go over the ethical impact of these personal beliefs and bias. In engineering, ethical responsibility goes beyond just following procedures. It's about protecting the public at all times. Engineers are obliged to speak up when they notice risks. Ignore small safety warnings may seem harmless, but it can lead to serious consequences and violate our ethical duty to safeguard public. Overconfidence is another common trap. It breaks the ethical principle of due diligence and careful risk assessment. Engineers should understand that true professionalism means having the courage to question unsafe or uncertain decisions, even when it is uncomfortable. These ethical principles and impacts remind us that safety, honesty, and courage must always guide our engineering decisions. Now I'm going to pass over to Mohit to give us the system issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Linda. The engineering-related system issues with the East Palestine Trail derailment consist of inadequate monitoring, inadequate regulatory oversight, such as emergency response training, issues with critical communication, and a lack of fire-resistant placards. Firstly, this tragedy could have been prevented if there was inspections, adequate monitoring systems of the wheel bearing. This would have resulted in the worn-out wheel bearings being replaced. Secondly, there was a lack of sufficient regulatory oversights where regulations could have been updated to inspect older rail cars to ensure that the pressure relief valve was updated to current standard of being enclosed by steel instead of aluminum. This would have prevented the aluminum housing from melting onto the pressure valve. In addition, there should have been regulatory requirements that prevented large amounts of chemicals being transferred closer together. Thirdly, first responders should have received training on how to handle these hazardous materials. Fourthly, there were major issues with the Northmore company communicating accurate information in a timely manner to the state officials. In addition, there was a lack of communication to residents about the health risks associated with the exposure, which is a serious ethical issue where the informed consent of the residents were never considered. Lastly, the placards for hazardous materials burned away during the fire. In conclusion, the system issues shouldn't have occurred and raise serious ethical issues as we should have sufficient training, monitoring of defective components, and preparation of contingency plans in case of emergency. Now I'm going to pass it to Nirmit, who's going to talk about the lessons learned.
Thank you, Mohit. So, as the lessons learned from this accident is the emergency response issues. Like the first response were lack of full of the train information and what the train contains. This is the communication issue that depicts that we failure of the EPICAS rule number one, where the engineers are responsible for the protecting public safety and environment above all the cases. Similar is the vent and burn decision, where the EPICAS rule number one has been already compromised, where five tank cars with the vinyl chloride were open to the atmosphere, and with the controlled burn condition, the chemical was released into the atmosphere. Environmental impact, as we have seen in this, is like the vinyl chloride and other chemical has been already released into the atmosphere, and EPA cleaned up the soil and water after the completion, full evacuation and cleanup of these train incidents. This shows that we compromised on the EPEGAS rule number three, which stresses more on the conduct ourselves with the integrity, objectivity, and fairness for the public for this rule. Next, we're gonna do like the lessons learned for the firefighter training gaps. Ohio law limits the volunteer training to 36 hours. Around 100 plus volunteers fought over there as a fire responders. They do not have the competency in their fire response. That overrides the EPEGAS rule number two, which emphasizes that every professional must work only within area of competence. If you are not competent enough, you must need to work under someone who is more trained or under someone's supervision. The another is the communications, where the train info was not shared properly, placards was not survived for the fire, and need better system for the emergencies. Like at the first, only the fire chief has given the evacuation order within the limited area, while the mayor within an hour evacuated the full city. This shows the robust communication system gap amongst each of the organizations. In line with the EPICAS rule number four, that engineers and organizations must take responsibility and ensure that the lessons learned lead to the improved system, not just for the compliance, but to rebuild the public trust. Now I am going to hand over to Viraj for the actions for the future preventions.
Thank you. So the actions for the future prevention would be, firstly, strengthening regulations and oversight. The system needs to be updated, like of safety regulations and transporting of hazardous materials, including stricter qualification and labeling of dangerous chemicals. Secondly, there would be technological improvements. The system needs to install advanced sensors to detect overheating, pressure changes, or leaks in trains. For example, they can install hot box detectors or infrared sensors. Thirdly, they need to be ready for emergency preparedness and response. They need to develop a standardized emergency response plan shared among all the rail companies, local authorities, and the fire departments. Fourthly, corporate accountability and transparency needs to be bringing in. Require public disclosure of hazardous materials being transported through communities. Fifth point here would be environmental and health monitoring. Long-term soil and water testing in areas near railway routes that transport hazardous chemicals needs to be involved. And establishment of environmental buffer zones near residential areas need to be there. The sixth point and the last point here would be policy and collaboration. They should promote collaboration between federal agencies, which Nirmit talked about, like EPA and NTSB, and the state governments for faster response policies. Investment in sustainable transport infrastructure to reduce dependence on rail for hazardous materials. So, thank you guys, and here are some references for our topic.